Hi everyone, I'm Stan Mallow. Welcome to Paranormal Yakker. My guest today is prominent ufologist and best-selling author Kevin Randle. He has a PhD in psychology and was in the United States Air Force and the National Guard, where he held the rank of lieutenant colonel before retiring in 2009. Kevin, who I've interviewed a number of times on the show, also has his own podcast, which I'll be asking him about later on in the interview. For now, the focus will be his book, 1970 Time of UFO Sightings, Landings, and Abductions. Kevin Randle, welcome to Paranormal Yakker.
Well, it's always good to be here.
1973 was a pivotal year for UFO sightings. The history of these sightings is the importance of them is explored in your book. However, before asking you about them, I would like to know, Kevin, what was happening, do we know, in the world in 1973 that might explain or account for the high number of UFO activity taking place?
I'm not really sure why we suddenly peaked in 1973 on UFO. I've noticed, others have noticed, that it seems to be cyclic in nature. We can take a look at 1947, 1952, 1957, then we were in the late 60s, 66, 67, Condon Committee came about, the Air Force closed Project Blue Book in 1969, and then suddenly there were another explosion of UFO activities in 1973. I'm not sure if there was any causal relationship between what was going on in our world and their world to cause that sort of explosion.
From inside landed craft, we're seen outside them gathering samples of the local flora and fauna. Where, Kevin, did these landings take place? And do we know the reason alien beings were interested in the plants and animals of the regions where they landed their craft?
What struck me as interesting in looking at all of this material, and it's something that I'd noticed a long time ago, was the difference between this wave of sightings and previous waves. Was it seemed that there was an awful lot of craft seen on the ground. You take a look at the 1947 sightings, for example, mostly they're up in the air. You don't get a lot of landings. The landings are things that you get pretty much turned out to be hoaxes. But in this time, you see an awful lot of that going on. And what struck me was, if I was an anthropologist or an archaeologist looking into, well, Earth's history, they were doing the sorts of things that I would have done, gathering the samples of the flora and the fauna. What do the wildlife look like? What do the plant life look like? How does it compare with my home world and that sort of thing? There didn't seem to be a lot of activity where they were studying it at that time. They would land the craft, they would grab what they want, and they would be gone quickly. And that kind of translates into a number of stories of alien abduction as well in 1973. So it kind of carries on through, I guess you could say, the entire spectrum of life on Earth, from the plant life to the animal life to the human life. So it was that kind of thing that caught my attention. And I'm not sure whether they were just gathering the samples to take to their home world to study them again, which we would do in similar circumstances, gather the kind of samples that we wanted and then take them back to our laboratories to examine them at length with the various technology we could apply to it. And that's just struck me as that seemed like what was going on here in 1973.
From the large number of alien abductions taking place in 1973, the best documented ones were those reported by Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. What, Kevin, are the specifics of their report?
Well, first, let me say that I had interviewed Calvin Parker a number of times. One of the things he said to me was that there had been other witnesses. A lot of that information came about later on, witnesses coming forward 4 or 5 years ago as opposed to at the time. And he said, no, there were witnesses that were identified in 1973. And that caught my attention. That's why I began the investigation into it. The story was that Hickson and Parker were fishing on the Pascagoula River back in October of 1970. There was a bright blue light that came down behind them and kind of paralyzed them, or creatures were seen coming out of it. They were kind of paralyzed. They were lifted up. They were taken in the craft, subjected to medical examinations or close examinations, and then put back into their environment, and the craft went away. I mean, that's the bare bones. They then went into Pascagoula. Stop, I think, was at a paper building, not because they wanted to tell the story to the press, but they didn't know what time it was. And they knew there was a clock in there. So they stopped there to see what time it was. But they then went on to the sheriff's department and talked to the sheriff about it. What is interesting about their tale is they were left in a interrogation with a recording device running. They didn't know the recording device was there. So they're left alone in that. The idea being, if they're engaged in some kind of hoax or there's some hanky-panky going on, they don't realize they're being monitored. They may talk about that and give away the whole thing, but they didn't talk about that. They talked about the frightening experience they had just suffered. They didn't want any press coverage, but somehow one of the sheriff's deputies got the press involved. And so within literally hours, their story was national news. And that brought in Dr. J. Allen Hynek from the Center for UFO Studies, and it brought in Dr. Jim Harder, who was an APRO consultant. I think he was the director of research for APRO. Harder was versed in the use of hypnotic regression, which I would have discouraged them using at all. I don't think it's a very good research tool. I think it's a wonderful tool to treat patients, diagnostic tool, but I don't think it's a very good investigative tool, because there's a phenomenon known as pleasing the operator, where you tend to answer the questions the way you think the person conducting the hypnotic regression session wants them answered. And that's pretty well documented. So that kind of bothers me, but Hynek was there from a scientific perspective as well. And Harder was there kind of a scientific perspective. They told the story. They were taken to Keesler Air Force Base to check for radiation. This is important because, as Calvin Parker told me, while there, they were interrogated by Air Force officers. There was, I think, the ranking officer in the intelligence was conducting part of the investigation, and other officers were there as well. What is important is there was a document created, I think it was October 12th, the day after the sighting, where they acknowledge that there are other witnesses. So it's not one of these ideas where people came forward 25, 30, 40 years later to tell their stories. There were people talking about the abduction and witnessing parts of the abduction the next day. There were 4 people involved. There was one guy alone, and there were 3 people driving across the bridge who witnessed part of it in a car. And they're named in the Air Force report. I think that when Ralph Bloom was doing his book right after this, he interviewed the people within months. So it's not that sort of thing. So we've got some eyewitness testimony to the abduction. It's one of the very few cases where we have eyewitness testimony. The other thing I probably should point out at this point is that Parker didn't want to get involved with the media, didn't want to have anything to do with it, didn't want to be involved with the interrogations. And Hickson told him, just tell him you were passed out and you don't remember anything. And that's what he did for years and years and years. So his story was always kind of truncated. It wasn't very robust. And Hickson was out there providing a lot of additional information. It was only many years later that Parker started talking about what he had seen. Part of it, I think we can lay at the feet of Philip Clapp, who met them in New Orleans, I'm thinking within weeks of the sighting, to talk to them about it. And of course, Class came in with his negative attitude, his skeptical attitude, his debunking attitude. And I think that tended to get witnesses not to talk to you. You come in with a negative attitude like that, you kind of ruin your opportunity to speak to them and get a good, robust idea of what they'd seen. I know Parker didn't want anything to do with him after that meeting. So you look at all of that thing. But an abduction case, I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, abduction, I'm not really crazy about abduction cases. I think most of them have terrestrial explanations. But if there's an abduction case we need to look at, this is the one, because of the multiple witnesses, because of the activities of the law enforcement and the activities of the military literally within hours of the report. So we've got a very robust case here for alien abduction.
In your book, you write about sightings that involve electromagnetic effects. Can you, Kevin, tell me about 1 or 2 of those sightings?
If you're talking about electromagnetic effects, I always refer back to the Levelland case, which is 1957. So it's many years before this took place, but it was a case where literally, according to the sheriff, Hundreds of people had called the office with their sightings, and in many, many cases, their cars stalled. Their engines quit, the headlights dimmed, the radios were filled with static and that sort of thing, all around the Levelland area, which is just east of Lubbock, Texas, for those of you who are unfamiliar with West Texas. The sheriff went out to investigate himself. It was a mini convoy. Behind his car, he was riding with one of his deputies. Behind his car was a car from the Texas Department of Public Safety, which I think is their basically state police. And what I discovered was behind that car was a car with Air Force officers. Now, the sheriff said officially to the Air Force investigator, or what the Air Force investigator reported, he just saw a red light in the distance. But the next day, according to an investigation conducted by Don Burlinson, who talked to the mechanic, the sheriff was there with his car to have the mechanic examine it to see what happened, to make sure it was working properly. And the only reason he would have done that was if his car stalled. And if his car stalled, the car behind him stalled, and the car behind them stalled, which Air Force officers were there present for a close approach of the UFO and having their car stalled. So electromagnetic effects are an important subcategory of UFO sightings. And I think the Levelland case is nearly as important as the Roswell case, and certainly as important as the Pascagoula abduction case, given the number of witnesses and given the investigative materials that were available. We have the same thing with Pascagoula. But there were similar cases reported in 1973 as well, where the cars were stalled and the people were surprised by that. The other thing I should point out about these car stallings, there has been a belief in the UFO field that when the UFO leaves, the car would start spontaneously. I looked at Mark Roddiker's report on electromagnetic interference on vehicles. I think he had like 485 of them reported over the years, starting, I think the earliest case was 1909 up through when he prepared his report. And I went through that carefully, and it looked as if very few of the cases did the witnesses report the car started spontaneous. They always took some action. Once the UFO left, the car could be started. There were hints of that. And I think that is kind of a misnomer. One of the reasons the Condon Committee, the official scientific investigation on UFOs, didn't look at the Levelland case, was because they could think of no mechanism where you could stall a car engine using some kind of electromagnetic pulse or whatever, and then you remove that electromagnetic field and the car would restart spontaneously. They were caught up in that same idea, and that was one of the important things you look at with the electromagnetic effects.
A National Guard helicopter crew experienced a close encounter. How did they describe what they saw?
This again was October of 1970, and I have to make one qualification here. The pilots of that National Guard helicopter, had the same training I did. So when I looked at the case, the Coyne helicopter case from Ohio, I understood what was going on in the cockpit because they had the same training I did, which I mentioned because Philip Klass, of course, came with an explanation that didn't work based on the training. But these guys were returning late at night, 11 o'clock, about to their home base when they spotted a light off to one side of the helicopter. And the aircraft commander said, well, keep an eye on it. It went toward the rear of the helicopter. Pretty soon, it's now on the right side of the helicopter and it's coming toward them. And this is worrisome for them because they don't know what it is. Eventually, it began pacing the aircraft. It was right above the aircraft, outside the aircraft, very close to it, a bright green light showing down on it. Their radio failed, so they couldn't contact the airfields around them. The helicopter, Coyne, the aircraft commander, had put the aircraft into a dive to avoid collision. So the collective was full down, the collective being what controls the up and down motion of the helicopter. The next thing they knew, the helicopter was rising. But Philip Klass suggested, well, the co-pilot consciously pulled up on the collective to avoid collision with the ground. And I said, no, what would have happened in that case in that cockpit was if the co-pilot, a guy named Jesse, was worried about them impacting the ground, he would have said, I've got it. Coyne would have released the control system, says, you've got it, and then he would take over flying it. I had a similar circumstance when I was flying in Vietnam. where my co-pilot, I was the aircraft commander, the co-pilot suddenly went into a dive to avoid hitting another aircraft. I had seen the aircraft. It wasn't close to us. He got the misperception and he put us into a dive. Now, had we been close to the ground or something happened, I would have said, I got it, taking control of the aircraft again. So you don't have each other fighting the controls. What Class was talking about was a situation that would have had Coyne wanting to keep the collective down and Jesse trying to pull it up, fighting for control of the aircraft. That would have never happened. And I mentioned several times, even in combat situations, you followed that procedure. It was ingrained in you to do it. So anyhow, the aircraft, the helicopter, Coyne's aircraft, began a rapid ascent, and finally he was doing everything to try to stop that ascent, and there was some kind of a noise, and suddenly he had control of the aircraft again, and he could now fly it normally. They went on to their home base. I think that there was also discussion, the magnetic compass was somehow affected by this, and it didn't work right after. Jenny Zeidman for UFOs did a magnificent job of putting the whole thing together, talking to Coyne. I talked to one of the crew members about what was going on as well. Jesse himself, the co-pilot, seemed to be the odd man out. The aircraft commander, the crew chief, what I would have thought of as a door gunner, but another crewman in the aircraft, all kind of talked about the same thing. Jesse had a slightly different attitude about it, and I'm not sure whether he was what motivated his difference, but there was some of that kind of discussion. There was a professional investigation done by Jenny Zeidman for the Center for UFO Studies, and her work on that case is very important. I have no explanation for it. There was a guy named Parabunk, his internet name, his username was Parabunk, and he thought that they had approached a refueling aircraft, and there was miscommunication between the refueling aircraft and their helicopter, because they were supposed to be, the Huey helicopter cannot be refueled in the air, but there are helicopters that can be. And he thought there was some kind of mistake there. But we looked into that, and I say we and a couple of other researchers looked into the idea. Practicing air refueling requires great coordination with the FAA and the agencies providing the refueling aircraft and the agencies providing the aircraft to be refueled. There are certain places where they do it. There are certain regulations that they are required to follow. We could find none of that in this case. There was no refueling aircraft in the area that we could find. There was no refueling area in that area where they could conduct those kinds of practice operations. So we kind of rejected that idea as well. So it's been a well-researched case. The crew was awarded $5,000 by the National Enquirer. That was back when they were doing their, if you come up with absolute proof of alien visitation, they would give you a whopping huge pile of money. And they, for a number of years, selected the best UFO case. And the people involved with it were just not the National Enquirer people, but it was, I think Dr. Hynek was involved in it and some other UFO person. Jim Lorenzen from APRO may have been involved with it, selecting the best case, and then they would award that, award a $5,000 prize. Travis Walton and his woodcutting crew won it, I think in 1975, they won the $5,000. So it was spread out over a number of years.
Each day it becomes clearer that the case for the extraterrestrial explanation for many UFO sightings becomes stronger, and the cases in your book confirms that. How far away, Kevin, are we from governments sharing with their citizens the evidence they have that proves alien beings have and still are visiting our planet?
When Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal exposed the Tic Tac, the Navy videos in 2017, I thought we were moving in that direction. The circumstance today, 7 years later, I am not convinced we were moving any closer. They've created committees, they've created panels, they've assigned various people to look into this, and all the reports we get normally is, here's how we're going to conduct our investigation, and here's where we're looking, and here's what we're going to do. Very little investigative work is being done. I did a book called UFOs in the Deep State. One of the things explored was, why would the government keep this a secret? And I think you have to look at the structure of our government to understand that. We have elected officials that come in at the very top, the president, the vice president, He appoints the secretaries of the various departments, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Transportation, Treasury, you name it, they appoint all that. So we have under the elected officials, the Congress and the executive branch, we have all these bureaucrats, and they stay on forever. So you get appointed in one administration, the other party comes in, you may lose the job, but then when the first party comes back, you get the job back again. And I think what we have going on here, the reason we're not getting any closer to disclosure is because it all relates to power and money at the top of our government. And they don't want to admit that there's things that are going on they can't control. The Air Force is required by their mission to keep our skies clear of invaders, whether it's a balloon from the Chinese or Russian penetration by their bomber aircraft, which has happened many, many times, escorted out of our airspace by our fighter planes and that sort of thing, or alien spacecraft. They're required to intercept those things. And when we get to the alien spacecraft part of it, nothing they can do about it. These things are much faster, much more maneuverable, probably almost impervious to our weaponry, although there are stories of radars bringing them down. You've got a situation where the bureaucrat, and when we get down below the secretaries of the other lower ranking bureaucrats, they stay on through administration after administration. And I think one of the things is they're doing their bailiwicks as carefully as they can, because some of this would radically alter our views of things and change the way our government may function or the way these bureaucratic entities function. I think that's part of the problem. They don't want that information to get out. They don't want to admit there's something going on they can't control. They don't want to admit there's something that may adversely affect the human race. The other thing you have to understand, and I'd said for a long time that if I was the president, I could get to the bottom of this UFO thing. I would go to the director of Central Intelligence and I say, I want to know about UFO. And if he said, well, Mr. President, you're not clear to know that, I would say, you're fired, bring in your deputy, and go down the list until I found somebody. But that's really kind of too simplistic. So I'm the president and I go to the director of Central Intelligence and say, I want to know about UFOs. He said, that's a complex question, Mr. President. There are other agencies involved. Let us pull together all the information we can so that we have all the agencies involved and we can give you the complete picture. Take us a little while to pull all this information together, give us some time, and somehow that time never comes. The best example that I can think of is when Jimmy Carter was elected president, and he was talking to George H.W. Bush, who at the time was the director of Central Intelligence, and he asked about UFOs. Bush said, well, I would like to remain on as director of Central Intelligence when you come in. And Carter said, well, I have my own guy coming in. And then Bush says, well, I can't tell you about this, Mr. President. You're not clear to know. At that point, Carter was a president-elect and not the president, so he could not change the director of Central Intelligence at that moment, but he couldn't get the information that he wanted from him as well. Probably what happened was when he came in, he asked the questions, and he got the answers of, we need to pull all that information together and we'll get back to you. There was a FBI operation run out of the New York office during much of the Cold War. It's called Operation Soul. The presidents were not read into that unless it became imperative that they knew something about it. Operation Solo, back in the 1930s, a guy named Morris Childs was a devout communist. He and his brother were way up, high up in the Communist Party hierarchy in the United States, were brought to the Soviet Union to discuss what was going on and that sort of thing. But they became disillusioned by it, and they became moles, if you will, trusted by the Soviets completely and totally, but they were working with the FBI. And the FBI office in New York City was the one that controlled that operation. And they didn't tell the presidents about it. The one exception that I know of is they told Gerald Ford right after President Nixon had resigned, and Ford now was going to have a meeting with the Soviets. They brought him in and gave him some of the information so he understood exactly what was going on. So this was an operation that went up through the 1990s and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then once Childs retired from that, then the information came out. I think a guy named John Barron wrote a book called Operation Solo. and outlines all this. The point simply is that there's an awful lot of stuff going on in the government run by specific agencies in which the president knows nothing. And Operation Solo, for the most part, was one of those. And I think a lot of the UFO investigations, a lot of what's going on in the UFO world is the same way. We're not going to talk to the president about it unless he asks specific questions, and then we'll give him the runaround. We're preparing the report. Something always comes up, and the president moves on to something else. Some other crisis erupts to prevent him from getting that information. And then the president said, what happened to that UFO? Well, Mr. President, we had this other project we had to work on that became a priority. It was a crisis mode that we had to work on. We'll get back to that other project now and get you some information. And then the president, of course, leaves office, and it no longer matters. Then you get a president like Trump that came in and he said he wasn't really interested in the UFOs. You had Clinton, who was interested in the UFOs. So also they kind of look for, where the president comes down on that as well. I think Ronald Reagan was interested in UFOs because of his own sightings. Jimmy Carter was interested in it. I've got Democrats and Republicans here is what I was searching for, that it's not just a partisan problem, it's a bipartisan problem that we're dealing with.
From the experiences you've spoken with, Kevin, did any of them tell you if the alien beings they encountered told them when they will show themselves in force to mankind? And if so, would there be a specific reason for them doing that?
The short answer is no. The longer, more verbose answer is somewhat. And we look at some of the abduction phenomena. They do say the Nebraska policeman, Shermer, who was abducted in the late 60s, when he was put under hypnotic regression, said that he had been given a message, but it wasn't time for it to be released. And there is some of that going on, but there really is no definitive date when that information will be given to us. Hickson and Parker didn't have anything like that from their contacts with the alien creature. The other thing is, in intelligence work, I know things that you may not know, and you're asking questions about it. There's a third party involved in this, and they also know that, think the United States and the Soviet Union. So I know stuff about what's going on in the Soviet Union that I'm not going to share with you. The Soviets can always do it. And once they do it, well, then that changes the conversation. So what I'm saying here is, investigating UFOs, we have this information, but the aliens can change everything by landing and revealing themselves. They have chosen not to do so. I just got dragged into the Kingman UFO crash from 1953, and I was looking at Ray Fowler's long report that he handed into NICAP. The reason I bring this up is because of the question you asked. He knows about the Kingman UFO crash and how the government came in. A guy named Arthur Stansel talked about it. In 1973, there was an article in Official UFO about crashed UFOs that featured on it. I've reported on it as well. When this new information came out from Chris Mellon, Kingman crash, I went back to the file and I read the whole thing carefully, which I hadn't done before. I had gotten to the parts where Stansel was talking about what he had done, but there was another segment where he was talking about contact with the alien. So he had a series of contacts with the alien creatures, which to me kind of reduced the credibility of his tale. He said that in his contacts with them, he asked about them revealing themselves or contacting Earth. And he said, these alien beings are not interested in Earth. They don't really care to come here. They don't really care to have much to do with us. That's why there hasn't been contact. They just really aren't that interested in Earth, which is kind of strange. I would think that if you found a industrialized society, civilization that is taking its first steps into space and has the capacity of destroying itself, maybe not with the atomic weapons that we thought of in the past or the biological weapons, but now with AI, if AI becomes self-aware, thank you, what is it, Skynet, it's over and we're all screwed that way. I would think that an alien civilization, an off-world civilization that has developed the capability of interstellar flight would be interested in a society at the cusp of this. Are we going to survive as a civilization? Are we going to manage to wipe ourselves out? If we survive, and I think we will, I don't want to be overly pessimistic. I think we'll work things out. It seems that we always work things out as we get to that crisis point. They have the capability of revealing themselves whenever they want to. We can only speculate about what their motivations are for not revealing themselves or when they're going to do that. They could be landing at the Pentagon right now, and you and I are tied up in this discussion, and we wouldn't find out about it until we end our conversation.
Earlier in the interview, Kevin, I mentioned that you now have your own podcast. Can you tell me about it?
I've been doing that for a long time. I also do a short segment on Coast to Coast AM once a week. I just did my 200th Coast to Coast broadcast last night. It's Thursday night or Friday night. It's usually the first Friday and last Friday in the month, and the other broadcasts are on the Thursday night, but it's just 3 to 5 minutes updating what's going on in UFOs. I talked a little bit about Christopher Mellon and the Kingman case last night, as a matter of fact. I do a show on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, cleverly called A Different Perspective, which of course is the name of my blog, for an hour once a week. It's kind of like what we're doing here. I invite on other guests and quiz them about what they know.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yakker want to buy 1973, A Time of UFO Sightings, Landings, and Abductions, or any of your other books you've authored? How can they do that?
It depends on your area of interest. 1973 deals with what I think is probably the preeminent alien abduction case. And I think it lays out a pretty strong case for it, but it gives you an idea of what was going on in 1973 as well. In the world of UFOs, it started in Georgia with a bunch of sightings and police officers involved and many civilians involved and that sort of thing. Lots of that going on. It kind of spread out from there. By the middle of September of 1973, you've got an awful lot of stuff going on. By the middle of November, it's all over. The sightings drop way off, but it gives you that feeling of what was going on in 1973, and it allows you to put it in the context of what was going on. There's a number of abduction cases in there. One of them was the Pat Roach case. I called her Pat Price when I wrote about it in a magazine. And I believed she had been abducted, but as I learned more and took psychology and learned about sleep paralysis, I'm pretty well convinced she experienced an episode of sleep paralysis. She didn't want her name known in the beginning, so I made it Pat Price just as a pseudonym for her. But her real name was Pat Roach. Very nice lady, but I think she experienced an episode of sleep paralysis and didn't really know what it was. Roswell in the 21st Century gives you a great overview of what transpired chronologically and where the investigation went. I think there's like 1,000 footnotes in the book, which I thought was always kind of funny. And people have told me they found the footnotes more interesting than the book itself, the way we went after stuff. I've got a lot of different UFO books. Just type my name to Amazon and the books will come up. You can find them in Barnes & Noble. You can find them in bookstores and other platforms.
Kevin Randle, once again, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yakker. It's always a great experience yakking with you.
Well, I enjoy the yakking with you, but you've got this weird guy looking over your shoulder, and I'm not sure what his problem is. What's his motivation?
I was there for the 50th anniversary of the Roswell experience in 1997, and everyone was taking photos of an alien that was there in the museum, and somebody else was also there, had one like that. So I bought it and brought it back to Canada. So he is from Roswell. Hi everyone, this is Stan Mallon of Paranormal Yakker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. So that you don't miss any upcoming shows, be sure to subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, just press the subscribe button on your screen.